Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today, I'm very fortunate to have with me Dr. Judd Kalkoven. Judd, how are you doing today?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Jack. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm doing well. Thanks for being with us today. Just to give some context for today's conversation, can you give us a background of who you are and your current role?
Yep. So, of course, my name's Judd Kalkoven. I'm a lecturer in biomechanics at Western Sydney University. I've actually only just recently moved to Western Sydney University. So before this, I was at UTS for a number of years. I basically did my undergrad at UTS, honors, PhD, and did a whole bunch of biomechanics teaching and lecturing there. And then I guess from a research perspective, my main sort of research areas are musculotendinous mechanics, and then also athletic injury is very much my interest. So intervention, so from a causality perspective, how we intervene to prevent injuries, and then also trying to solve some of the injury prediction problems that currently exist.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned that because I also do really value some of the research you've done with looking at hamstring function, which we might talk about a bit later, but talking about sporting injury and sporting injury models, because this is something that I've thought a lot about myself, and that's how I came across some of your research, is sometimes I think it's good to take a step back and think about the philosophy of how we kind of look at the human body and the human system. Because I think often we get focused on going, all right, well, how do we stop hamstring injuries? What are the interventions we need to use? But sometimes it's good to take a step back and think about, well, what is an injury and what are the factors that are actually involved? And I was actually interested to hear, because I know you've obviously published quite a few papers in this area, and you published a paper that I've looked at a lot, looking at a conceptual model for understanding soft tissue injuries. Can you explain a bit about the model that you created and what was the actual influence or that led you to that model?
Yeah. So I think the paper you're talking about is the model and the framework paper. Mm-hmm. So I map out that whole framework. Yeah. So the way that sort of came about was Franco Impellizzeri, who's one of the professors at UTS, joined UTS. This would have been a number of years ago now, but I was very interested in muscle mechanics, and I was reading a lot about muscle mechanics, also how it relates to injury, so muscle injury. I was quite deep down that pathway, and so Franco Impellizzeri joined, and we had a conversation about injury, and he was suggesting that in the applied research space, there's a whole bunch of conceptual issues around injury. At the time, the acute to chronic workload ratio was quite a big thing. And
which I've read some of those papers that you've been involved in, yes?
Yeah, Franco is well known for critiquing it and criticizing it, essentially. So, but essentially, we sort of had a discussion here, and it was clear to us that there was a clear missing link from a conceptual perspective that's sort of facilitating what we considered, poor research approaches. And a big part of this is that for the research process, just in general, for science in general, you should really start with a comprehensive theoretical framework, essentially explaining your phenomenon, right? So with a theory, it's really just an explanation of whatever it is you want to research. So if I want to research injury, I should really start off by building a theoretical framework that sort of explains this phenomenon as best as I can, and I'm just mapping it out as best as I can. And then once I have that framework, now I can start to test the various assumptions within that framework. But what sort of happened was no framework for injury existed, really. So it's like there was this big step in the research process that had just been really the first step had just been jumped over. And the way I sort of describe it is what I see was going on was there was this hit and hope approach. And what I mean by that is, in a lot of my more recent writings, I talk about the importance of theory-driven research. And this was not theory-driven research. This was, what data do we have available? So what are we measuring? And can we just use whatever data we have available to try and predict like injury occurrence or whatever? But for me, it's an unprincipled approach, right? It's just like, because this data exists, we're going to use it and cram it to solve the problems we want to solve without actually thinking about what this problem actually is. So essentially I started working on this framework with Franco, and part of the main things that I wanted people to get out of it was to really start thinking about tissue mechanics. And if you think of injury, I mean, fundamentally, at its base level, it's an engineering problem, right? So why does a tissue fail? Well, you apply a force to it, it exceeds the strength of that tissue, and the tissue ruptures, right? So, and same with like overuse injury, right? Repetitive mechanical loads damaging the tissue over time. Yes, there's physiological processes around remodeling happening there as well, but this mechanical component is really central. So one is we wanted to highlight some of these mechanical components, and to get people thinking about how far removed the data they're collecting actually is from these mechanical phenomena that's occurring, in the tissues for these athletes. So yeah, one of the main things I was critical of is obviously sports teams are very reliant on GPS data because GPS exists and they have access to that data. And one thing I wanted them to get out of it is to recognize that you really know nothing about the underlying mechanics of the tissue from that data. Like a GPS data just gives you spatiotemporal data. If you stamp your feet on the ground, do a whole tap dancing routine, you've essentially quantified nothing. Like you don't know any forces, you don't know any tissue damage, you don't know anything. So if I'm trying to predict, let's say, when an Achilles tendon is going to rupture, right? There's just no way you're going to be able to do it from that data because it's just so far removed from the actual phenomenon that you're trying to research. So yeah, a big part of that framework was essentially producing that theoretical framework that hadn't been developed to explain this as best we can, integrating some of the mechanical and engineering principles that exist, particularly from biomedical engineering and structural engineering, and to integrate that into it. And then, yeah, just to emphasize just how far removed a lot of the data being collected is from injury occurrence.
It's something that really stands out to me is often there'll be some research done looking at, for instance, muscle architecture or the acute to chronic workload ratio as an example, and people run purely just with that. And it really depends on the person who's running with it. Often we become a little bit too simplistic of thinking that here is the panacea, here is the holy grail. All we need to do is eccentric hamstring loading or just monitor the amount of training load that they're doing. And something that I really value about the idea of looking at a framework, to take a step back and then think about, well, how do we view injuries, thinking about that engineering model, and then what are the moving parts? And I feel like that's something that often isn't discussed a lot, even from a research level, and particularly when I think researchers, this is not everyone, but often when research is presented, it's often presented in isolation. But then I also think of clinicians and coaches. There's often a lot of times people are looking for that very recipe protocol approach of going, I just want to know step 1, step 2, step 3 to rehabilitate a hamstring injury. What I'm interested to hear, though, from you is you've developed this theoretical model. How does that influence what people should be doing from a research perspective? Because I often think about the way that you look at it is there's a lot of different moving variables or parts. But the way that research is often done is it's often just looking at, one particular intervention and looking at an outcome. Do you think we need to think a little bit differently about how we do research to reflect probably these models that demonstrate a bit more complexity in how injuries occur?
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately it depends on the problem. So for the injury problem, I think a big thing that is, essentially why I do the work that I do is trying to explain the complex system. So people often talk about complex systems and a move to complex systems, but I find that it's often used as a bit of a buzzword, to be honest, but we actually have to try and explain the complex system at some point, right?
Well, I've gone down this pathway a lot of looking at complex adaptive systems and understanding the theory behind it. But I think something that I've noticed for myself is I'll get caught up in the intellectual pursuit of trying to understand how to identify an injury, but then don't necessarily find any real life solutions to it. So I'm interested to see, how do you sort of think about applying it then into the real world?
Yeah, so one of my most recent paper really goes into this in quite quite detailed. So I really emphasize the importance of frameworks, and more specifically, how these can facilitate causal models to obtain causal effects from observational research. So essentially what I've done with a framework is I've provided a generic explanation of this complex system. But then what we can do is more specifically is start to produce causal models, right? And a causal model is, I'm going to say, a more sophisticated tool than a framework, in that a framework can be relatively generic, but a causal model, usually it's what's called a causal directed acyclic graph. It's not as complicated as it sounds. Essentially, we use arrows and variables to show cause and effect relationships between each other. So variable X causes variable Y. We draw an arrow going from variable X to variable Y, and you can start to map out a system that way. But more than just being conceptual, this is really a mathematical model. So each of those arrows represents a specific mathematical effect, specifically a causal effect. And then once you have a model that is accurate, right, that sufficiently maps out a system, what it allows you to do is that if you want to obtain causal effects to try and figure out how to intervene to prevent an injury, for example, you can start to manipulate this model and control for certain variables to try and obtain the causal effect. So essentially what it allows you to do is control for bias in this complex system to try and obtain these causal effects. Now, the limitation with this approach, opposed to, let's say, an RCT, is that if your model is wrong, then the causal effects that you're obtaining are going to be wrong as well. But the way around that is essentially you can propose a causal model. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but we can start to test this model. So you can start to validate the model by testing the various assumptions and relationships within the model, and then also seeing how effective it is in practice as well. So yeah, you can propose a model, but there's ways to also test the validity of the model.
I'm interested to hear a little bit more about the concept of causality, because in my exploration of trying to look at how do we identify humans, and like we mentioned before, we can think of humans as complex adaptive systems. What does that mean? One, we can adapt to stresses. And two, complexity describes that there are lots of different modulators or variables, and they seem to interact with each other, sometimes in non-linear ways, to get a particular outcome. And I'll explain in a moment, like an actual real-life situation, because I don't want to make it too theoretical. And from my understanding, the idea of complexity means that you may not necessarily always see a causality between variable X and variable Y. And what I mean by that is, we could, for instance, get a profile of an athlete where we get an idea of their flexibility, their strength. We can even think about things like strength endurance, max strength, power, elastic function, their biomechanics. And when we think about all these different variables we look at, these different variables interact in a way that lead to a very unique signature for that individual. And if we change one variable, i.e. improve strength, the specific change that you see in that individual might be different to another person who has slightly different flexibility measures or mechanics in how they move. So I'm interested because I know the person I often do my podcast with, John Nicolosi, he's a coach himself. So he works a lot with athletes, obviously monitoring a lot of variables at once. And he often describes it as he's looking at modulators and thinking about, if I slightly adjust this modulator, I increase the volume a little bit or change the intensity, how does that reflect the emerging pattern of that athlete? Is that how you think about it? Or do you think actually we can be a bit more direct in thinking, well, no, if we have the right model, we can actually see a very causal link between this variable, and that's constant amongst an individual or a group of people?
Yeah, very good question. So my answer is that there's certain problems where I think a causal model is appropriate, and there's other problems where I don't think it's appropriate. So in examples where you've got essentially these interactive effects and emergent properties, causal models don't perform well, right? They're still trying to figure out solutions in causal inference on how to deal with these problems. So sometimes you might need to use other approaches, maybe towards a dynamical systems approach or something else. It really depends on the problem and the nature of the problem that exists. My perspective is from an injury perspective, causal models are going to work very well, just because of the nature of the problem. So because essentially we have hundreds of years of engineering research to lean on, we actually know the underlying mechanical characteristics of like tissue failure very well. We can explain it pretty well as well. And there's a clear causality here that exists. And part of the way you can determine causality, again, it depends on the problem, but temporality, right? Like if I punch someone and it hurt them, right? To say that I hurt them, therefore I punch someone makes no sense. There's a clear sequence of events that's occurring here. So if we know the sequence of events, it makes sense that we would add that information into our model. So often like, this is even it's a deeply philosophical question, because there's people like David Hume that famously argue that causality doesn't even exist. It's essentially a way that we conceptualize the information to try and make sense of it. And in some cases, it's probably better to think of the world in terms of just probabilities without temporality, when you might not know the temporality. And in some problems, it's better to think of it as cause and effect. And it's not that one conceptualization is necessarily right or wrong. I think it just depends on the type of problem, which approach is best and which will yield better outcomes.
Okay. Because another question I was going to ask then is, because you mentioned before about predictability. And obviously the idea of being able to predict injuries is something that's the holy grail, so to speak, of a lot of sports scientists and I guess also coaches and clinicians. But it's something that I think about. Can we actually predict whether someone is going to get an injury? Because it seems to me that the more we learn, the more variables we start to understand that are influencing how the probability of someone injuring. I mean, do you think that eventually we can get there? We eventually can actually quantify all the variables and understand that relationship? Or do you think is it actually possible?
Yeah, so I'm actually very confident that we're going to be able to predict some types of injuries. So I think something that's important to acknowledge is that often we talk about injury as like this singular thing that occurs. When in reality, all these injuries have very different mechanisms and different processes underpinning them. And because of that, we need different solutions, right? So I think one thing that has bugged me a fair bit with the research in the space is treating injury as just the singular thing that occurs. When in reality, I do think we need to focus on specific types of injury that are solvable, and then really, commit ourselves to trying to solve a single type of injury at a time. Now, in terms of this idea of so many variables influencing injury, now that is true, but there's a distinction between intervening on these variables to have a causal effect versus prediction. So prediction can actually be very simple in some circumstances. And I think a causal model is a great example of a way that we can very much simplify our models to get accurate predictions. And this is currently what I'm writing about in a paper I'm working now. A paper that I'm working on now is basically how we're going to achieve athletic injury predictions. And essentially, I'll give a simple example to explain how this works. But in causal inference, you have something called the Markov assumption. And basically what this refers to is, I'll give you a scenario, right? Let's say I want to predict you based off of DNA. Now, from a causal perspective, your parents obviously caused you, but we can go further back through all your ancestors. So I could go, well, your grandparents caused your parents, and your great-grandparents caused your grandparents, and like all the ancestors all the way to the beginning of time, right? Now, if I want to predict you, all I need is the DNA of your parents, because all of the relevant statistical data to produce you is in them, right? Because they're the mechanism through which the ancestors' DNA is passed on to you. So if I want to predict you, that's all I need is your parents' DNA. Everything else beyond that is irrelevant, right? That doesn't mean that it's irrelevant from a causality perspective, right? It's just from a prediction perspective, because they're two separate problems. So I'll give you another example where this is relevant. If I'm interested in bone fracture risk, predicting bone fractures in, let's say, an elderly population, right? You could say, okay, we know calcium intake is very important for bone strength, right? So the mechanism through which calcium impacts bone fractures is through mechanical strength of the bone, through bone strength. So if I want to predict these injuries in the elderly population, the only measure I need in my model here is bone strength. Adding calcium intake is actually redundant. It's the same thing as the family tree scenario, right? All of the relevant statistical information for prediction is captured in bone strength. So I don't need to put calcium in my model. So then we can start to refine our models towards these more proximal variables that contain more of the information. The only problem here is that to yield useful predictions, there needs to be appropriate opportunity for intervention. So I'll give you an example from an injury perspective where we could predict an injury and it would be extremely useful versus another scenario where it's not useful at all. So if I wanted to predict, let's say, Achilles tendon ruptures in athletes, technically what I need to know is the mechanical load that Achilles tendon experiences and the mechanical strength of that tendon, right? So let's say, hypothetically, we have an athlete that has a tendon strength of 10,000 newtons, right? And let's say we know that on a given game day, the highest load the Achilles tendon will experience is maybe 6,000 newtons. If I have an accurate measure of that tendon strength, let's say I scan them and I get like an accurate strength measure, which is something we don't currently have right now, but let's assume we did, right? Then the next week I scan them again and their tendons now has 9,000 newtons of strength. And I scan them again and it's 8,000 newtons of strength. And now it's starting to approach the 6,000 newtons that we know they're going to experience. If you obtain accurate estimates of this, you can essentially apply probabilistic models where you calculate the probability of failure. And you can make, depending on how accurate your measures are, potentially very accurate predictions of this occurring. Now, in this scenario, that would be extremely useful, right? Because we'd be able to intervene when we're tracking the deterioration of this tendon strength over time. So that is an actionable prediction. Where leaning on these more proximal variables like strength and load doesn't have value is like an acute tissue failure where, like, let's say someone slide tackles and breaks your leg, right? Sure, you might have measured your bone. You could maybe measure the bone strength and the amount of force applied to your shin, but it's immediate, right? You can't, like, there's nothing you can do about it. You're lying there with a broken leg. So it hasn't helped you in any way. Like, technically, you've predicted it. In a mathematical model, you're making that prediction. It's just not actionable in that scenario, so it's not useful. So in a scenario like that, then you need to start moving towards, I'm going to talk from a causal model perspective. You have to move towards the more distal causal variables because those might enable you to intervene. So then maybe I'm looking at things like the situational pattern that resulted in a player sliding in and breaking someone's leg. And then we could look at ways to manipulate that situational pattern so that it doesn't occur. So that's why I said it really depends on the type of injury as to what the solution actually is and how we go about predicting it to enable these interventions.
Yeah. A couple of things I take from that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like one, like you mentioned, is what are you actually measuring? Because a lot of things I think that people mention are proxies. You, like, for instance, mechanical load through GPS data, or looking at the behavior of the muscle tendon unit, or the architecture of muscle tendon unit. But you're suggesting, well, the main outcome is the bone broken? Do they actually strain the muscle? And I often think back to the basic way that research is done is like you implement an intervention and you see what the outcome is. But I almost feel like the way you're describing is, well, we know what the outcome that we want to look at is. What are the things that contribute to that? But I think that's and that's where sometimes I get confused though too, because reality, there's probably a lot of things that influence, for instance, a bone fracturing. And although we could think about, or a tendon rupturing, and although we could think about that a certain amount of newtons would lead to the rupture of a tendon based on its mechanical properties, it seems that the mechanical properties of soft tissue, of biological tissue, varies a lot though, based on things like sleep, diet, your psycho-emotional state, and how that influences like your neuromuscular patterns. So that's where I sort of sometimes think, how can we look at causality if we know that our musculoskeletal system is in this constant state of flux? Because there's so many things that, because then this is where I was going to ask this as a question of, you'd think about it from an engineering model, but I think, well, do we need to look at it from a bioengineering model? Because it's not just simply tissue that's inert, it's a biological system that's constantly changing based on all these other variables.
Yeah, so, okay, there's two things I want to answer here that you mentioned. So one is this idea of proxies, and this is, again, where I've been critical, right, is that, and then I'll go back to the GPS example. Mm-hmm. There are so many leaps that are occurring that essentially the error is just insane. Like, you just have no certainty. So I'll give you an example. If I try to, so let's say I have estimates of the mechanical load, so the forces experienced by a tissue, right? If I then try and apply a cumulative damage estimation method to estimate tissue damage from that mechanical loading, small errors in that mechanical loading result in massive errors when trying to estimate the damage. So, for example, if I have a 9.9% error in mechanical load estimates, when trying to estimate the damage from that data, I'm ending up with 104% damage estimation error, right? So you can see that you have this problem of propagating error going through the system where the errors just blow out very quickly. So then if you go one back, you're going like a GPS data, which doesn't even measure mechanical loading. And you're trying to go, okay, well, this kind of reflects mechanical loading, which kind of reflects damage, which kind of reflects injury. And like by the end of it, there's just so much noise here that you're so far removed. There's just no accuracy that you're going to achieve a prediction here. Which is exactly what I've essentially been critical of. Like, it's so far removed. And like, I'll give you another example. We might go, fatigue might cause injury, but then if you're getting your data from a GPS, you're trying to infer fatigue. Like, you're not actually measuring that they're fatigued. You're just assuming that they're fatigued. Yeah. And then you're assuming that fatigue contributes to injury, or you're assuming they have muscle damage, but you're not measuring muscle damage. And then you're so there's these huge leaps that are occurring that by the end of it, you essentially have something that's unworkable. So yeah, that's one thing I wanted to tackle. And then your point about the complex systems, this is the difference between prediction and causality though. So like what you're interested in is intervention. So there's all these variables. So sleep can impact injury risk, right? Maybe your nutrition, maybe your training status, maybe your age, all these variables, you're correct in saying they have a causal effect on injury outcomes. So if I want to intervene to prevent the outcome from occurring, that's a causality problem, but it's not actually a prediction problem. You can predict, but you don't even know what to do. So an example of that is, and this is actually a big problem with big data, right? So let's say, I guess with artificial intelligence, let's say I want to predict Achilles tendon ruptures, and I just have all the data I have access to. So I'm at a sports team, and they just give me every bit of data that they have collected, and I put it into an artificial intelligence model. And this model predicts that they're going to rupture their Achilles tendon. And let's assume it's very, very good, right? In that scenario, the next question is going to be, let's say I predict, whatever player is going to rupture their Achilles tendon. The next question is going to be, okay, so thanks for predicting this tendon. What do we do? And in reality, if I know nothing about intervention, obviously we know enough about recovery and rehabilitation that we could probably do some good things. But assume we don't. You could have prediction where you're accurately predicting something through a big data approach, but you actually have no idea how to prevent it from occurring. You have no idea how to intervene. You don't know what to do. You're just like, sorry, like I'm predicting he's going to get injured. I didn't say I could stop it. So they're actually two fundamentally different problems. Prediction and intervention are two different problems.
Yeah. The thing I actually get from this then too, because I think of, let's say, monitoring load through distance you covered. It seems to be actually something that's adopted a lot in professional sport. So there seems to be, well, I'm assuming that people do find value in it, even though there may be some statistical limitations based on what research has been done. Do you just see that as also just reflection on what actual technology we have available to measure proxies of mechanical load, and that it's actually quite a removed proxy because it doesn't actually give you an indication of internal forces experienced by individual to individual?
Yeah, I think so load management and load monitoring, if you look at it through an injury lens, then I'm very critical because and it's clear in the data, right? There's actually no models that we can recommend for injury prediction in these contexts. Like we've got nothing to offer. I think Bollock had a great review paper in Sports Medicine 2022. I'm trying to think what it's called. But essentially it highlights that we can't recommend any models to use in this scenario. But that doesn't mean that training load management is useless because it's used for lots of things, right? You're managing the fitness of the players. You're managing
progressive overload,
performance. Like that. That's the whole performance element. There's also holding people accountable. Like if I have, so I'm definitely not arguing that people should can the GPS and put it in a shed somewhere. Like if I'm a coach and I have a squad and there's one player that looks like he's slacking off, I want to look at his GPS and be like, is this guy actually running way less than everyone? And if he is, I want answers, right? I think the point is just not overselling what this technology is capable of, right? It's useful for some things, but it can't do everything. And injury prediction is one of those things that it performs extremely poorly on, which is why we have no prediction models to recommend on that data.
And do you think eventually too, and like it's something I think about with research, is often looking at the average at a group level, but ultimately, and I think particularly for coaches and clinicians, you're working at the individual level, and there's actually quite a bit of variability in response to any type of stimulus, whether it's mechanical or non-mechanical, from person to person. It seems that the idea of trying to predict injury actually has to be on an N=1 basis because we do see a lot of individual variability.
Yes. So also, so this is a very important point, actually. One of my biggest concerns is that we know injury has all these really negative problems around, it ruins careers, it holds people back, it just sucks in general. But if I look at the strategies used around injury prevention, so training load management is a perfect example. There's a cost to training load management. And the cost is often that these athletes are not training or not playing, or you're reducing their exposures or whatever it is, right? Now, to me, that's a significant cost. So let's say I have an athlete. I'm going to choose up Cristiano Ronaldo, right? If I want to tell Cristiano Ronaldo that I don't want him to train anymore, and he tells me, no, Judd, I still want to train, how accurate does my data need to be to go, no, Cristiano, you're not training anymore?
Yeah.
And the uncomfortable truth is, I think the data needs to be very damn accurate to do that, right? Yeah. And if it's not accurate, it makes me so uncomfortable that this is what's happening. And I know this is what is happening in sports teams. So if I look at like young athletes, a lot of them can't do any extras even though they want to. So like training ends and they cut off and they're like, oh, I feel really good. I want to do some shooting practice. So I want to do whatever it is they want to do and they feel good. and coaches or sports science staff say, no, you're not doing that, that decision makes me very uncomfortable because you just have no accuracy in your predictions. Like, you're doing that based on what? Now, there's other potential reasons you could do that, right? Maybe there's scheduling reasons around, you have a really important game on the weekend and like, this is a must-win game. We don't want any risk at all. So it's a risk tolerance thing. But in general, it's just that our quantifications of risk in these scenarios are extremely poor. And you're right, there's an ethical problem here that like, you're managing individuals and there's a cost to these interventions. And if you don't have accurate predictions to back them up, it's a bit of an uncomfortable position.
How do you reconcile that? Because I feel at the moment, this is probably more prevalent in my profession as a physiotherapist, is when I think about like what we do clinically, we think of research, we think of clinical experience, we think of individual values, beliefs. But there's a very strong narrative about what the research says, and we have to do exactly what the research says, or what the most recent, RCT is as an example. But you like really highlight here that the reality is, if you're looking at prediction models, you probably have to be very cautious of how much you apply that verbatim to and expect to see, your ability to determine when someone gets injured or when someone doesn't. And it's probably a more broader question of like, how do we think about applying research in the real world? I don't know if you actually have an answer to that, but...
No, I do. So, I mean, the thing that's really important is the performance of the models that you're using, right? So obviously, living in a world with so much uncertainty is uncomfortable, and people want answers and they look for answers, but often they look for the answers when they simply don't exist right now, right? And it's just uncomfortable because, like you said, people want to be told what to do by the research.
Yeah.
But what if the research is inconclusive? What if you don't have any high-performing injury prediction models, to use? Well, the answer is that you can't really do an evidence-based approach because there's no real strong evidence to go off of. So, I mean, in that scenario, and this is essentially what I think, particularly in relation to injury, you have to do to a large extent, is you have to commit to some sort of philosophy of training load, and you can base that on. I don't want to. I mean, essentially anyone can do whatever they want here and make a philosophy, and you can back your philosophy, and maybe it works really well, in which case you're a hero, and maybe it doesn't work at all, and in which case you have to accept responsibility for it. That's the nature of it. I also think something that's probably a bit misunderstood from a research perspective, and this is really the approach. I think where people have criticized me in the past or asked me questions is they see my research and they like it, but they don't really know how to apply it, right?
Well, this is actually going to be one of my questions because, and particularly in your most recent article, the athletic injury research article, there's like a lot of jargon that I wasn't really familiar with. It's very theoretical. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, because when you approach writing such a paper, how do you think about it? Do you very much think about it from a real world perspective, or do you think of it very much from just purely that philosophical standpoint? And how does it actually get applied?
Yeah, so very good question, because this is something I want to clarify. I am largely working on a different level because I'm going after like a big change later down the track, right? So often people think that research needs to serve the applied world today. Like if you're doing research, like it should help us today. And that simply is not how science works, right? A lot of the really big advances happen, in labs over years and years of refining something. And then when you finally have a product, you release it, and then it has big impact. That's the nature of it. So I'll give you some examples that sort of mimic my approach that I guess I like to draw some parallels with. Is that if you watched Oppenheimer, right?
I actually watched it very recently.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So how they went about building the nuclear bomb, they didn't just do this random hit and hope approach where they just like whatever data they collect, they're just mishing it together and they just randomly came across a nuclear bomb, right? They map this whole thing out theoretically. They do all the mathematics behind it. they get the needed materials, etc., etc. And once they've mapped this out so well theoretically, they just build the bomb, and it worked, right? And that's similar to, I guess, the approach that I'm taking, where I'm trying to map this out and really understand the system as best I can, so that when I'm doing my applied research, I'm hoping that I'm really going to solve the problem. But it just takes a lot of time to go through this approach. Like, I can't produce something today and be like, here's my model that predicts injury, because it just doesn't exist. It's almost like, I want to get to
you're almost trying to get like a bit of a paradigm shift to how we actually approach the question and the problem itself.
Yeah, correct. I mean, it's a very different approach to what I think currently is being done. I kind of see it as like, we want to get to the moon, but right now, this is going to sound like a bit of a example, but right now we sort of have like a cardboard box and fireworks that we attach to the side. It's like, I want to get to the moon. It's like, I'm sorry, it doesn't work like that. It's like, we have to build a rocket. It takes years. There's funding. There's problems that need to be solved. We're just not going to get there. And the reality is that we need principled approaches that are meticulous in nature, that are actually going to solve the problem. And I'm not going to be able to produce high precision, high accuracy injury predictions today or tomorrow, but I'm working towards it. So when I do release something, hopefully in 10 years, I want it to be a game changer.
Well, with that in mind, because when you do speak to people working in the field, clinicians, coaches, sports scientists, what's the kind of feedback that you get? Is the feedback, or is the response, well, okay, this is an interesting theoretical, intellectual pursuit, but how does this apply in the real world? Or do you actually find people going, actually, I do see value in this, and I often think about it like this myself? And people are actually looking at adopting these kind of models already in the real world. What are the responses that you get?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag. But I find the ones that criticize, I wouldn't say criticize is fair. They don't quite get it initially. It's just because they don't really understand where it's going. And then I find once I can explain where it's going, then they get it, right? And there's plenty that just, they get it. And they're just like, I see exactly where you're going. Like, I've had a lot of people reach out to me, and they're trying to solve the mechanical loading problem on tendons to try and, or whatever tissue, to try and estimate cumulative damage. Like, they get it. They get it immediately. And the other thing is, I'm also not, there's a place for research at all these different levels, right? You have researchers that are looking 10, 15 years into the future. Where are we going? What are we doing? You have researchers that are serving clinicians now to try and answer questions that clinicians care about today. And I'm not criticizing them. It's just, there's a place for all of these different approaches, and all of these approaches are doing different things, and they're working towards different things, essentially.
The other thing I think too, that's an important message here that I think you're trying to tackle is, it's not just necessarily about trying to learn more about content and facts about, say, muscle function or how to train an athlete, but actually sometimes taking a step back and thinking about, we all actually have a framework or a model we use, whether we realize it or not. And sometimes we actually need to step back and challenge or critique that framework and going, are there strengths, are there limitations to this framework? What has influenced that? How does that bias the decisions I make in the real world? And I think that's something actually a lot of people don't do enough, is actually take a step back and challenge their philosophy, because we all have it. And like, again, I often think about this in my profession as a physio, where you got like physios, you got chiros, you got osteos. Everyone seems to be against each other and thinking that one's better than the other. And I often think, well, maybe it actually is worth getting perspectives of other types of clinicians, because they may have perspectives that may be quite radically different to you, and you don't necessarily have to agree with them. But there actually might be some valuable things that you learn in the process of going, actually, that is quite a useful model, or a useful perspective that I haven't taken into consideration in my own model and actually expand your model from that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said. Like, I think a big important, like something I try to push to people that I speak to is that for each of these problems that you're trying to solve, the really big problems, I think you should really have an explicit framework that you have mapped out that, like you said, it shows you all your assumptions. It shows you all your biases, and you can actually test those assumptions scientifically to see like, oh wait, I'm full of shit. Or like, oh no, these are good assumptions and my model is good. And you know, some people will have absolutely great models and some won't. And you know, that's the difference between good clinicians and not as good or whatever it is. But at least it's transparent, right?
Well, and look, the reality is the pursuit of growth and development also means that sometimes you'll come across things that don't work or are ineffective, and you also need to abandon them as well. But the reality is you don't figure it out typically in the first go, do you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely.
You know, something else I'd like to touch on briefly, because I mean, a lot of what your research at the moment, or a lot of what your research is talking about these frameworks and models and philosophies that we use. But you obviously have done some other research specifically in the mechanical behavior of the hamstring, and specifically during sprinting. Can you actually talk a little bit about the research that you've done? Because it seems that we're hearing a lot of different perspectives now about hamstring function, running mechanics, when a hamstring does get injured, how does the hamstring tendon unit function during sprinting? So I'd be interested to hear what research you've done and some of the conclusions that you've come to.
Yeah. So I guess I'll give some context around this paper. So I think this paper came out 2 years ago, but essentially it's a conceptual exploration of hamstring muscle tendon function, essentially when sprinting, right? Particularly focused on the late swing phase of sprinting. So the way this sort of came about is there was quite a few theories bouncing around to do with, do the hamstrings function isometrically as this like isometric spring-driven way of moving, where really the muscle in theory contracts isometrically and the tendon sort of stretches and recoils like so, or is it this eccentric behavior where the musculature and the fascicles lengthen to try and absorb some of the energy that exists? And basically where this evolved into is what sort of exercises should we prescribe to train the hamstrings to mimic this? And this is essentially where I got frustrated, because there were massive caricatures of muscle tendon function that were underpinning these recommendations, right? So I'll give you an example where the extrapolation sort of went wrong for me. Is that it was, okay, if the hamstrings behave as this isometric spring, then we do isometric exercises, and these exercises mimic or more closely mimic hamstring function when sprinting, right? Now,
but you're making a lot of assumptions already about, I feel like, when you make that statement too, yes?
Well, that's where it led down to. So there's but not only that, what it does is it's actually using two different definitions, and they're referring to two different things. So I'll give you an example. An isometric exercise doesn't necessarily mean the hamstring behaves isometrically.
Yes.
In that exercise. So what you have is like, one is referring to the fascicle behavior, one is referring to how it presents as like the joints not moving during inactivity, right? But really, these are two completely different things.
Well, and you could probably go by extension too of, because, you know, you could also then talk about, as you mentioned before, are we talking about isometric contraction only of the muscular portion or the muscle and the tendon portion? Because they also can decouple.
Correct. So what I was trying to do, and like the similar thing around the eccentric, and what I was trying to do is emphasize just how unique, regardless of how it functions, just how unique hamstring function would be when sprinting, that none of these exercises reasonably mimic what's occurring here. So some of the things I discussed here is the muscle stiffness and the tensions produced are finely regulated by the activation pattern that exists, right? So in order to execute that the sprint cycle is that you have this fine-tuned regulation of stiffness and tensions that allows the muscle to lengthen exactly when it needs to, or shorten exactly when it needs to execute this and to manage essentially the mechanical phenomenon that is sprinting. And if you look at, so let's say it behaves sort of in the spring-driven manner where the tendon absorbs a lot of energy and then recoils. And let's say there's this big spring component. If you look at sprinting, right, you have knee extension occurring at over 1,000 degrees per second. Like these exercises aren't even coming close to these. Like never mind isometric where you're holding it still, and then the forces are like 1.5 times the maximal forces that like sprinters can produce isometrically. Like it's a completely different phenomenon. So I think what I was trying to get across there is to really emphasize the complexity of the mechanics of hamstring function and just how unique it would be. I mean, the other part here is that because that you have all these different hamstring muscles with all this varying architecture, is that you have non-uniform strains all throughout the musculature. So different parts of the muscle are doing different things at different times. There's just so much variation here that like to say these exercises mimic hamstring function when sprinting. No, these exercises, like it just is so far from the reality that, that's essentially what it's writing the paper.
I'm glad you say that, because I often scratch my head a little bit too when people look at it too simplistically, because there is such complexity to human movement. And like you've mentioned all those things, and not to mention the co-contraction of muscles within antagonistic compartments or adjacent compartments, other muscles, and not to mention connective tissue within this myofascial plane in terms of below or above those joints, and the amount of force transmission, the amount of very unique firing of motor units, which there are thousands of within the muscle at different points of the sprinting action. It just seems to me that the idea that you can simplify it down to an exercise or a group of exercises that, even just from the standpoint of, don't necessarily mimic joint positions, the rate of force development, the speed of the momentum of the body, seems a little bit far-fetched. But with that in mind, how do you actually look at that balance then between, it seems that the most useful thing that you could actually do to condition hamstrings for sprinting is to sprint, because it's the most specific thing you can do, versus using concurrent training like resistance training as some way to facilitate the capacity of the hamstring to tolerate, say, forces during sprinting?
Yeah. So very good question. I think something I need to clarify here before people attack me is that I'm not saying these exercises are bad. Like I'm not anti-isometric exercises. I'm not anti-eccentric exercises, right? These all have a place, right? Isometric exercises, I think, are great from a coordination perspective. They're also a lot less damaging. So in season, there's clear benefits here to be obtained. Eccentrics as well, there's clear benefits to be obtained. So I'm not saying they're useless. I'm saying that the argument that these exercises mimic hamstring function when sprinting, to me, is a ridiculous argument. So I'm not saying the exercises are useless. There's a place for them. But I think you made an important point, and this is going to give away my bias, but I think it's a very reasonable philosophy. The best way to learn to tolerate sprinting is absolutely to sprint in some capacity. And I think this is something that I've been around enough sports teams I think the philosophies that are occurring, or the way I see this done in practice, is a big problem for me, but I think it's due to a cultural problem amongst sports teams. And what this is that, so a lot of sports teams don't do any sprinting at all in training, but then obviously on match day, they have to sprint. And the way I see that is like, it's almost like you have a power lifter and all they do is 100-kilo bench press. And then they come to competition day and you say, I want you to bench press 150 kilos. Like anyone would say that's absolutely nuts. The person's going to get injured. They've never done that. I see it as a very similar thing. But the reason I think it's evolved is because when injuries occur in training, the sports scientists can get blasted, especially if everyone in that staff thinks it's because of training loads and whatnot. When an injury occurs, what are the training loads, right? And the sports scientist is probably crapping themselves because they're about to get blasted for this.
Yeah.
So then what's the consequence of that? Well, I don't want my players to sprint, and you become hyper-conservative. I think this problem of hyper-conservative, where if they get injured on match day, it's super chill, right? That's out of my control, not my fault. If they get injured in training, it's on me and I'm responsible. And I'm not necessarily criticizing the sports scientists here, because it's a tricky position to be in, right? You're essentially you're essentially copying the blame for something that I think to a large extent is out of your control, and is random relative to the data that you have. So it's a natural response to become more conservative. Like I think it's a cultural problem around injuries that, unfortunately, the sports scientists or the physiotherapy, depends on the sports team, cops the blame for injuries that really, I think the majority of these are very much out of their control.
Yeah, and I've spoken to colleagues of mine about this. By default, it seems that the easiest way, the safest way to avoid that is to be conservative. But the problem is, particularly when you're working in a high performance environment, it's almost like you're always at that cliff's edge, and you kind of need to continue to apply enough stress to continue to develop that individual to perform at the highest level without breaking them. And so, the issue that you have then is, do you have consequences on their performance because of the lack of opportunities that you take in training?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And then also on top of that, like if they're not getting injured in training, that's great. But if the injuries are increasing in matches, that's a problem as well, right? So whatever it is, like there's clearly going to be a cost to doing that. I think the other thing is that, like, even if I think from different philosophies around managing this, there's scenarios where I could imagine an athlete hasn't done a lot of sprinting at all, almost throughout their career. So maybe as a young athlete, they did minimal sprinting through training. And maybe you're a new S&C coach or whatever, taking over a team, and you go, okay, I want to implement some exposures to sprinting. And you do like a minimal exposure to start off with. And these players are so unconditioned to it. Like, they're pulling tons of hamstrings. And it's not that your philosophy is necessarily wrong. It's just that, like, there's so much data you don't know leading into that position.
Sure.
That, like, even if you have a reasonable philosophy, I can see scenarios where it ends really badly, and I can see scenarios where it ends really well, and just so much of it is out of your control.
Yeah, and look, I actually think that really highlights, again, that importance of understanding individual or even group profiles, because the reality is, the more you work with an athlete or an individual, the more you understand their unique profile and understand, like, what are the key modulators that lead to success in performance or injury prevention. And part of that's obviously related to understanding their prior training history. And so that's, I think, one of the more important but nuanced things about working in the real world is you do have to take it from a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, correct. I mean, the thing is you're still very much managing human beings, as well. And like a big part for me is managing the psychology of athletes. So one of the things, especially from an injury perspective, is I'm very anti-data driven research until you have very accurate data. And then I'm more about athlete informed approaches where you are in constant communication with the athlete, and you're sort of managing the person, and you're managing the psychology around injuries in case they do occur, etc. And it's a much more of an art approach there that I value a lot. I think that's actually the right way to go about it.
A question I always ask our guests, and it's actually one I'm particularly interested to hear from you, given the space that you work in and the perspective that you take with your research, is things that you do outside of your professional work, because I think you are very much working at that philosophical level. And so are there things that you do to help support that very openness and philosophical thinking outside of what you do in your 9-to-5 job?
Yeah. Well, I wish it was a 9-to-5. Definitely way more than that. I guess, I mean, the honest truth is I do work a lot. The things that interest me, all right, so outside of work, I put a big emphasis on my relationships and social life. So because I do work a lot, I don't have that much spare time, and I need to manage my relationships. So I try and socialize and spend as much time with my friends and family whenever I can. But outside of that, I mean, this is going to come as no surprise. I'm very deep into philosophy.
Yeah.
So all the books I'm reading they're not purely work related, but I've been making my way through all of the Stoicism books. So Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Socrates, etc. And then I've gone on to more modern philosophers, I guess, Rene Descartes, etc. And then, I mean, this is science related, but I'm big into causality and anti-realism versus realism. So a lot of that reading when I can, but then outside of that, I really just try to spend as much time with friends and family whenever I can. That's my priority. So I don't have any activities that I really do outside of that, like a bit of working out and gym and whatnot, but nothing worth mentioning.
Judd, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast and taking some time out of your busy schedule. If people are interested to follow your work, where can they find you?
I've got Twitter and LinkedIn, so you can feel free to add me on either of those. If you just search my name, there's not many Judd Kalkovens around, so I should pop up. Alternatively, my email is j.kalkoven@westernsydney.edu.au. So you can always feel free to reach out. If you just look up my research profile or my university profile, you should be able to get some of my contact details from there.
And also, just a shout out to our listeners. As always, please do like, subscribe, leave comments. They're very useful for us to be able to spread our message to as many people as possible. And Judd, thank you very much for being on here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.